Welcome to Bergen Banter, the official podcast of Bergen Community College, the spot for intelligent, fact-based conversation. Never mind the noise and the chatter. We're here at Bergen Banter. I am your host, Larry Levanka, and today's topic is one of geography and a little bit of history. So we've brought in Professor Keith Chu from our history department to talk about a few things that have risen into national prominence, especially as President Donald Trump has taken office over the last few days. Matters of geography, including the Panama Canal, the Greenland as an item, and the Gulf of Mexico, that may be the Gulf of America, but we'll get there in a little bit. So welcome, Professor Chu. And we'll start with the Panama Canal. I think people of a certain age understand what the Panama Canal is, but that certain age is rapidly getting older and older. It's really 50 years ago that the Panama Canal was in the consciousness of the American public. So let's start there. The Panama Canal, what is it? Why is it strategically important?
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So the Panama Canal is essentially, it's a man-made artificial waterway. It's one of the great man-made wonders of the world. It's in the country of Panama. And this waterway allows the connections between the Pacific and the Atlantic, or the Caribbean Sea, Atlantic Ocean, what have you. This canal allows ocean-going vessels not to go through the tip of South America, Magellan, Straits of Magellan, Cape Horn, the treacherous waters there. So it saves weeks and thousands of miles. It's a major source of revenue for the Panamanian government. I think it generates up to $2 billion in revenue. It has locks and gates, about 6 pairs of locks. And the countries that use it the most are the United States, China, Chile, Colombia, South Korea, Japan. Right, so it's a very important international transportation artery. And as I said, it's an engineering marvel that it was actually built in the early 20th century. We can sort of get to how that was actually done. Actually, to navigate the canal at certain points, it is very precise. So the ships do need pilots. The captain of the ship simply just can't go through it. And sometimes the tolls, the transit fees, can range up to $300,000, $400,000, $450,000. You have had large battleships go through there, Iowa-class battleships like the USS New Jersey. You have cruise ships that actually go through the Panama Canal. So it is a major source of revenue. It's a source of pride for the Panamanians as well.
And so, okay, the why is pretty easy to see, right? As you said before, it is an artery, a strategic artery. Let's get to the how, though. How was this constructed all those years ago? Obviously, there's a lot of history to that, and the land rights to it, or the usage rights to it, changed over time. So let's start how it was built, and then over time, why that transferred from one country to another.
Actually, in the 19th century, the French had an interest in building this waterway to make the transit between the two oceans more efficient. But and they thought of Nicaragua. But Nicaragua is very difficult. It's a country north of Panama, and it has mountains and volcanoes. So the level of the mountains and the volcanoes would have been more challenging. Now, to do it in Panama is also very challenging. This is a country that has rainforests. It's along the Continental Divide, and you have to move tons and tons of earth. And the men who would build this canal would suffer through disease like malaria, yellow fever. There's tropical fauna that can be quite dangerous. So it was a real challenge for the French who tried to build it in the 1880s, but it was a disaster. It cost a lot of money, and it was actually a scandal in France. And so the United States, at the turn of the 20th century, 1904 to be more exact, the US had an interest in taking over this sort of French project. There was actually a railroad that was also attempted there. But to unload the cargo would have been sort of prohibitively too expensive. And the U.S. had an interest simply, as far back as really the 1840s or 50s, because once gold was discovered in California, people wanted a more efficient way to get to California. So the United States, under the administration of Teddy Roosevelt, and President Roosevelt saw the Panama Canal not only as a commercial necessity, but also a military necessity, because the United States they had a battle fleet. They had these early battleships, and so they saw the Panama Canal giving the United States an opportunity to have a one-ocean navy rather than a two-ocean navy. And so the United States essentially brought the rights to building the canal at that time. Now, Panama...
With cooperation from the Panamanian
That's right.
government?
So Panama was actually a province of Colombia. And the Colombians did not want to give the United States the contract to do this. So with tacit approval from the American administration, the Panamanians revolted, and they saw the canal as as a way to bring prestige to their country. And so the U.S. in a treaty called it's the John Hay, Philippe Bunau Varilla Treaty. Okay, he was the French engineer and sort of diplomat who sort of negotiated the treaty and was very pro-canal, that the U.S. actually built this. The United States paid something like $375 million, $10 million to the Panamanian government, and I think $40 million to buy off the French assets. And the U.S. would pay $250,000 annually to have perpetual control of the canal. So they got control over the 10-mile canal zone. The Panama Canal is about 50 miles wide, and there was an expansion project earlier in this century. And it's like between 500 to 1,000 feet, and so it's relatively, it's not that long, right, when you think about it. But it does take about 10 hours on average for a ship to transit. And when they expanded the canal earlier in the 21st century, these mega ships, these Panamax ships were able to get through.
Was it popular domestically? Was the money seen as money well spent at the time, or was it rejected by the American public?
Right. So obviously, like any sort of geopolitical question, you're going to have both sides. So there were a lot of they saw themselves as patriotic, sort of pro-imperialist Americans who wanted the United States to compete with other world powers like the British and the French and the Germans, and President Roosevelt was one of them. I mean, he actually visited the canal while he was in office, the first American president to actually take kind of a foreign trip abroad. He did this tour. He went to Puerto Rico, as well. So remember, Congress has to approve any treaty according to the Constitution. So it was passed by Congress, and there was a lot of pro-canal sentiment. They thought this was a way for America to project its power, to that part of the world. And so it did get a lot of support. Now, I don't know if there are sort of public opinion polls that existed at the time. No, there are people who opposed American expansion. And this was very much part of the American ideology of manifest destiny that every kid learns in school.
Yes.
And so it was. This was seen as a very important strategic asset. It was built mainly by Caribbean and Black workers. There were lots of deaths through accidents, through disease. They had to use dynamite and so on to do this. But there were some Americans who thought this was not appropriate. But I would say, as a sort of a historical educated guess, most Americans supported this canal.
So it gets built.
Yes.
It's opened. It's a strategic resource. It's a strategic asset. Take us through then what happens as the decades start to go on.
Right. So by the 1960s, when there's anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism in the world, the Panamanians, there were actually violent demonstrations against the U.S. presence in Panama because the U.S. is operating the canal. And so there was some thought that maybe we need to give the Panamanians a little more kind of autonomy in the way they're going to operate the canal.
Or stake in it.
Stake in it, right. Yeah, so that's a way of looking at it, absolutely. And then, so by the 1970s, under the President Jimmy Carter administration, which is quite ironic, so you have President Carter, he negotiated the treaty. It was the Neutrality Treaty, Panama Canal Treaty in the late 70s, 77, 78. It was passed by the Senate. It's actually called the Carter. It was the leader of Panama was a gentleman by the name of General Omar Torrijos. And in phases, the Panama would be returned back to the Panamanians. There's a Panamanian authority that sort of operates the canal. And there were Americans at the time who opposed this. People like future President Ronald Reagan, said, we built the canal, we pay for it, we should keep it. So there was even opposition back then. But by 1999, the transfer was complete. And the U.S. left. Now, I think if you want to talk about it militarily, I think at the time, we don't build battleships anymore. And so that the battleship necessity probably fell out of favor because what we do now is we have these forward-deployed aircraft carrier task forces that aircraft carriers can't really fit through the canal. So militarily, it wasn't seen as necessary. commercially, it was still very, very important. And it's coming back on the scene now, right, under President Trump.
Yeah, and President Trump is talking about retaking the canal because it is a strategic asset and we're leaving money on the table, and it was money that the United States spent.
Right, that's right.
So that sort of begs the question. I'm sure that the Panamanians aren't interested in giving up a resource, something that brings in revenue for them.
Right.
What would a negotiation even look like between the U.S. and Panama? Could they just shut us down and say, we're not interested, go away?
This has been created through decades of delicate diplomacy. You have to look at international law. Now, if you look at the treaty, the neutrality treaty, the United States Senate and the supporters of giving the canal back to the Panamanians believe that the neutrality of the canal would be maintained. The independence of Panama would be protected by the United States. Panama really doesn't have a military, so it does rely on the United States in that regard. And the transit fees, now if you read the language of the treaty, I'm paraphrasing here, it says something like the transit fees have to be just, equitable, reasonable, and in accordance with international law. So the understanding when the treaty was done was the Panamanians are going to charge the United States these tolls, with the understanding that the tolls are going to benefit the U.S. in some way, based upon alternate transit routes, how to maximize American commerce. And I think President Trump and the current administration believes that this has been it was a really bad deal, that the fees that are being paid by American ocean-going ships, it's exorbitant. I think that's the word that he used. It can be said that 40% of the goods going in and out of the Panama Canal either leave the United States or are coming to the United States. So he says that part of the treaty, the transit fees has been violated. Also, the neutrality part has been violated. Because what the Panamanians have allowed recently, for example, is Chinese investment. So the Chinese have an interest in the developing world. They are investing in the developing world, making loans to it. And the Chinese have built 2 ports at either ends of the canal. Okay, so this is a major competitive rival to the United States geopolitically. The company is C.K. Hutchinson, I think the other one is Lambridge Group. They built ports, and so to President Trump, this is a violation of the neutrality part of the Canal Treaty, and so he thinks the Panamanians have violated it. Therefore, we're no longer obliged to uphold the treaty.
So it's difficult to speculate exactly where this could go, but is it enough for President Trump to say we want to negotiate a new deal and the Panamanians just shut him down, or something more?
The Panamanians have Panama has some great baseball players, right? Mariano Rivera, Rod Carew. But the Panamanian leaders, the political leaders, the presidents, they know the United States. Many of them were educated in America. They speak fluent English, many of them. They're economists or lawyers. So it's going to be very, very difficult because this is Panama's source of revenue and pride. And this isn't, I think what President Trump is looking for is a return to, those old days, right? Where countries play like games of Risk, right? The board game, right? You just simply take over a territory, and he sees this as an opportunity. And he sees the Chinese, he'll use the Chinese as sort of leverage and as an excuse to say, this is very dangerous for our national security, and the Panamanians need to kind of own up, to us. And remember, he is a shrewd businessman, so maybe he's doing this to add pressure.
Right, and it could be that it's more posture because he's trying to reduce the rates that the United States ships pay, and has no interest in actually returning the rights of the canal to the United States.
Yeah, I think it would be very difficult to seize this unilaterally. I think it would be condemned by many countries.
And would require military intervention.
It may require some sort of military intervention, and the Panamanians are basically saying no. The Panamanians want to have good relations with America, right? And they've actually scaled back in some of these Chinese projects. They've delayed or postponed or canceled many of them. So the Panamanians realize that America is important, and so I think it remains to be seen, what the new administration is going to do. President Trump sees this as a valuable strategic asset at the end of the day.
I think that's the point here, that during the campaign and sort of the interim after his election, but before his inauguration, he was bringing up some of these things: Panama, Greenland, Gulf of Mexico, et cetera. And I think a lot of us were watching saying, is this posturing, or are these things that he's actually going to pursue? And then as we heard in the inauguration speech, he brought them up. So clearly they're on his mind, and clearly we're going to see what happens in the future and if he continues to pursue specific action. So let's turn to what he sees as another strategic asset, or what could be a strategic asset. This time it's an entire country, and it's not something that the U.S. actually built or spent money or lives. The country of Greenland, which President Trump has said that he wants to acquire. And again, part of the United States' manifest destiny. Greenland, talk about it.
Right. So Greenland is it's a large landmass on the top of the world. It's sort of the gateway to the Arctic. If it was actually an independent country, it would be the 12th largest country on the planet. It's the largest island, non-continental island in the world. I think it's got less than 60,000 people. So it also has the distinction of being the least populated territory on Earth. It is an autonomous sort of territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. There is a Greenland culture and language. Okay, but it's covered by massive ice sheets. Some of these are a mile thick. 80%, I think, of the territory is covered by ice sheets. So it actually plays a very important role in it's almost like a thermostat. It moderates the planet's temperature. But Greenland doesn't actually it's got fjords and stuff on the south. That's where most of the population centers are located. Nuuk is the capital. But Greenland is not affected by the Gulf Stream. That's why the temperatures are more severe. Unlike Iceland, if you look on a map, and I encourage our listeners, our viewers, to take a look at a map, as they're watching this podcast. Iceland is quite near. Iceland actually does get those moderating effects of the Gulf Stream. Greenland does not. But Greenland also has enormous natural resources underneath that ice. And so as this land is being exposed, there's more drilling. There can be more drilling. There can be more mining going on. It's got cobalt, copper, gold, things you can use for modern technology.
And when you say exposed, you mean by global warming?
Yeah, that's
by the warming of the Earth.
More land is being exposed, and so you can use these raw earth minerals for things like wind turbines and computers and electronics and all sorts of things. And also, as the Arctic ice is exposed, there is a new ocean path opening up in the Arctic Ocean. And I think in the last couple of decades, 30 to 40% increase in ship traffic up there. And countries are investing a lot in these ice trawlers, these ships that break up glaciers. And so Greenland is becoming strategic as this new land opens up. Now, in World War II, the U.S. had military bases there to protect the island from the Nazis. And then the Cold War, and if you look on a map, if the Soviet Union ever launched intercontinental ballistic missiles, they're going to go through the Arctic. So the U.S. During the Cold War placed these early distant warning radar stations there. Once the Cold War ended in the 1990s, the U.S. abandoned that endeavor. So if you go to Greenland today in certain parts, you're going to see massive amounts of abandoned U.S. military hardware. The U.S. does have a space base, a military base up in the northeast. Pituffik, I think, is the name. Pituffik Space Base up in the far northwest of the country. But now it's becoming strategic again. I mean, the U.S. is simply they reopened the consulate in Nuuk when it was abandoned in the 1990s.
So when you look at it as a headline,
right?
President Trump wants to buy Greenland. Right. Okay, it seems crazy,
right.
But after describing the strategic positioning of it, the natural resources that are there, maybe it's not so crazy.
Yeah.
Is Greenland for sale, though?
Right. So the U.S. yeah, right. That's a good question. And if it is for sale, he is a real estate
that
tycoon,
is true,
right? So how much is it worth? Is it worth $200 billion? Is it worth $300? Is it worth $1 trillion? The U.S. has acquired territory through purchase before, the Louisiana Purchase, right? The U.S. has acquired territory through occupation, through purchase, through cession, through military occupation and
Force.
So on. Force, as well. And so it is. The Greenlanders have said, and the Greenland's prime minister. Greenland has as I said, they have a culture. His name was Muta Eagle, I think is his name. He's the prime minister. He said Greenland is for Greenlanders. Greenland's future should be determined by us, not by the United States, not by Denmark. So, what kind of negotiation is this going to look like?
Right.
There might be a referendum that might be needed. Nuuk is actually closer to New York City geographically than it is to Copenhagen. So it is in North America per se, right? And it's not, do you really consider Greenland a part of Europe? Probably not, most people. But, I don't think that can be done unilaterally either, right? I think the people of Greenland, they have to make that decision, right? But President Trump sees this as an absolute necessity because the Chinese are investing in Greenland as well through their Belt and Road Initiative, where they are. Greenland doesn't have a large airport, so the Chinese offered to build an airport. Now, of course, hypothetically, let's say the Greenlanders defaulted on that loan, the Chinese could simply take over that airport. So right now, there is actually considerable U.S. investment in Greenland for tourism, for mining, and to build airports, right? Vast parts of that country, it's inaccessible, unless you fly in there. So,
and that's probably a lot more palatable to those living in Greenland.
Yeah, they don't mind. They don't mind American, investments. And Greenland actually acquired its sort of home rule, self-government status in 1979. Ironically, around the same time that the Panama Canal treaties were being, forged up. So. I think the Danish presence is really, really important. Denmark sees itself as, outside the European Union, the United States is Denmark's largest trading partner. We get furniture, we get cheese, we get chemicals from Denmark. So you need a good relationship with Denmark. But, Greenland has now become a point of contention. And the Chinese, they see themselves as an Arctic power. The Russians are already an Arctic power. And, China is 1,000 miles from the Arctic. So this is seen as also a national security threat. The Chinese have this interest in Greenland and they want leverage and influence there. And so I think that's what President Trump is viewing this as a real, he sees this as a multipolar world. It's right. And other countries are not playing by the same rules, are playing by certain rules. And so we have to play by those rules as well. And that if we sit back, we're going to lose. Right.
So maybe the question then isn't about acquisition, but perhaps that's how President Trump wanted to start the conversation in his, bold, brash way, right? But it's more about the access to Greenland, the partnership with the Denmark government, et cetera, right?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more about investing and promoting tourism there. The U.S. it's relatively close, obviously, to America, and although President Trump I think still believes that global warming is a hoax. But this global warming is having an incredible impact on Greenland as this ice is being exposed. No one cared about it for decades. And now everyone has this interest in it.
Yeah, right. And it's almost like, global warming is a hoax, but implicitly, since the ice is melting and you now have access to different things, it's almost an implicit agreement that there is global warming. That's
and this sort of goes with the speech, his inauguration speech about the frontier, that possibilities, and he sees Greenland as the new frontier.
Very Teddy Roosevelt in that sort of mindset as well. We go back to what we were talking about with the Panama Canal. So I guess the final geographic item that we want to talk about here is the Gulf of Mexico, which President Trump, once again, has made bold and brash statements that it's not the Gulf of Mexico, it's the Gulf of America. Now, to take that at face value, well, what does that mean? Do we just keep saying it enough that it becomes the Gulf of America? Is there legislation that has to occur? Is it that we just go to Rand McNally and say, hey, X out Mexico on all of those maps. We want it to be the Gulf of America. What's the deal here?
Right. So, this situation is not new, right? There are many places on maps geographically where there are name disputes. What comes to mind, the East Sea in Korea, it's called the Sea of Japan, but the Koreans actually call it the East Sea. The Persian Gulf, the Arabs want to call it the Arab Gulf, and so on. So I do think name matters, but there is a professional geographical kind of organization that sort of recognizes certain names. Are they going to have to agree with this? You're probably going to need to have a congressional law, a law passed, some sort of, can the president do an executive order or a proclamation? Not sure. You're going to have to change textbooks and maps and so on and so forth. I don't know how Americans feel about this. Is this really that important to them?
Right.
Now, it just may be him grandstanding.
Sure.
President Trump loves that, and he's always used that to his advantage. It's going to be very, very difficult to do. I mean, you can change those things on American maps, American media, right?
Yeah.
But will other countries recognize this? How will Mexico feel about this, right?
And I think the president has come out to say
this is right. No,
it's ridiculous.
Right. Right. So you do want to have good relations with your neighbors, right? So I don't think this should be a priority. I've grown up with it as the Gulf of Mexico.
It seems like, though, we keep coming back as we start to sort of wrap this up.
Yeah.
It's all intertwined, right? Geopolitical issues, matters of geography, matters of trade, and matters of money, right?
Right.
All of these things seem to come back to that it's not just necessarily, well, maybe the Gulf of Mexico notwithstanding, but especially the other two items for Trump, this is about U.S. manifest destiny. It's for strategic importance in the world. It's about shutting out Russia and China and positioning the U.S. as the dominant figure in these different areas in the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere, western hemisphere.
Right.
So they're all tied together. Are we seeing and I think that brings to the question, is this calculated by Trump? Or is this just him looking in a history book and saying, the Panama Canal used to be ours, it should be ours again. Oh, the Gulf of Mexico, no, it should be the Gulf of America.
Right.
Is there a calculus here? Or do you think there's a calculus here about the geopolitical environment and the strategic environment that he's making about these things?
Yeah, I would advise the president to maybe, read the historical context and the background, of these places. They exist on a map, but everything is about, you do need to know a little bit about the history of these things. It's not something, the president of the United States has a lot of sort of formal and informal powers. And taking over Greenland, taking over the Panama Canal, it's a lot more complicated because there is a lot of sort of different actors and organizations involved. Greenland is autonomous. It has a sort of self-government going on. Greenland can negotiate with other countries and organizations, unlike Puerto Rico. You see, so you have to take that into account. And personally, I think he's sort of bluffing. I don't think he's that serious about it because it takes a lot of hard work to do something like this. You can't simply just send special forces to the Panama Canal and take it over.
And I suppose that's a good point because he is term limited at this point. He only has 4 years. The purchase of Hawaii or Alaska, I mean, you could tell me, how long did that take?
Right.
Was it more than 4 years?
I mean, it's negotiations could really drag on, right? So it does take a long time. It's not something you can do overnight. You can do a lot in 4 years. But I think the world there's just too many complexities involved right now, and
priorities, as you said before. Are American people beating down the doors to say, we need Greenland, we need Greenland? No, I think there are issues of the economy and so on that we could get into on another day. But for those reasons, it seems to make sense that perhaps this is about posturing for better position, better trade deals, better terms in different things, rather than actually acquiring some of these things.
I don't, when he says he wants to make Canada the 51st, that's a big state. But so I wouldn't take it too seriously. He just wants a better position when he negotiates with these foreign countries.
We'll have to see. And in a few years' time, if we're talking about Greenland as the 51st state, or if we're talking about the Gulf of America, we can bring you back and we can talk about that. Sound
All
good?
right, love to do it.
All right, Professor Chu, thank you very much. Bergen Banter, the home of intelligent, fact-based conversation, never mind the noise and the chatter. We are here on Bergen Banter, and we will see you on our next episode.